All right, for more on this, let's turn to our Turning Point panelists. Saeed Khan is a professor in the Department of Near East and Asian Studies at Wayne State University. He joins us from Detroit. And Sam Nutt is Executive Director of War Child Canada. She's here in Toronto. Saeed, I'm going to start with you. It seems that this was a full-blown crisis before a lot of attention was paid to it. Why was that?
Well, we have to see, Susan, that this is something that is really decades in the making. As the report says, yes, the Rohingya refugees are now stateless in Bangladesh, but they're also stateless in Myanmar. They have been stripped of their citizenship. They are utterly marginalized and persecuted by first the military junta and now with the complicity of Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, as well as Buddhist monks. They have really now been suffocated in their space, and we find that the level of intransigence and outright complicity on the part of the Myanmar government to add to the misery of the Rohingya makes it a very, very difficult situation.
Sam, you now have, as Nala described, legions of people descending on a poor country that can't even take care of its own people. What are the biggest risks for these impromptu refugee camps, which are massive?
Well, it's responding to that scale of need, which Nala pointed out. I mean, you're talking about a massive, it has to be very well coordinated humanitarian response. But when you have so many people arriving so quickly who have health needs and who are traumatized, and many kids that are unaccompanied, separated from their parents, so there are real protection risks, security risks. I mean, these are tremendous needs. And then at the same time, you have very little infrastructure, very little capacity. And on the part of the Bangladeshi government as well, there has been certainly an effort to restrict access on the part of various aid organizations and try to control the process. But unfortunately, right now, this area really needs an escalated humanitarian response. And so that means much more open borders, much more access to this kind of population on the part of experienced aid organizations. And unfortunately, that is not something that we're seeing right now.
Saeed, the BBC is reporting that the UN, some of its officials inside Myanmar were deliberately diverting attention from the Rohingya situation. Is that possible? Is it a possible scenario, and how would that have affected international attention?
Well, this is certainly going to add to the woes of the image of the United Nations coming off last week's opening of the UN General Assembly, where several world leaders, including President Trump, were highly critical of really what is the relevance of the United Nations. But I think at the same time, we have to be cynical that the same voices that are protesting the impotence of the United Nations to act are ones that are complicit in creating those circumstances. One of the reasons why the United Nations was unable to do anything here in Myanmar is, first of all, Myanmar has blocked UN observers from even coming into the country to go to the Rakhine province where the Rohingya emanate, and also recognizing how geopolitics are playing a big role. China, of course, is providing full support for the Myanmar government to allow it to do whatever it pleases without fear of any kind of retribution or sanctions, because China has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council with veto power.
I want to talk about ethnic cleansing for a moment. There's been an evolution in the talk of that over the week, and I want to just show you two statements from Canada's Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland. Let's take a look.
Based on the reports, this looks a lot like ethnic cleansing, and that is not acceptable. Based on reports from the region, this is ethnic cleansing.
So that was over a week. Looks like and is. Why is there timidity around calling it ethnic cleansing, Sam? And where are we at on that?
There's a hesitation sometimes to refer to it as ethnic cleansing, because under the responsibility to protect doctrine, that creates the conditions under which international governments would have a duty to respond, a duty to try to protect this very vulnerable population. And so there often is a lot of kind of holding back when it comes to formally declaring something like this as ethnic cleansing. At the same time, the evidence over the past few weeks has become absolutely irrefutable. You even have the UN Human Rights Commissioner who has referred to it as ethnic cleansing. The Secretary General has also turned around and said that if you don't call it ethnic cleansing, what do you call it? I mean, this is what we're looking at. So I think that over the last few weeks, there are now more and more governments, more and more UN officials, agencies that are calling this for what it is. It certainly has all of the hallmarks of ethnic cleansing. And now the question becomes, well, how should the world react to provide support to this population under these circumstances? And as Saeed has mentioned, I mean, that's very complicated because you've got intransigence on the part of the Myanmar government.
So, Saeed, what is the next step? When does the world start sending in these kinds of signals?
Well, I think, first of all, there has to be some way to then circumvent the possibility of either a watered-down resolution in the UN Security Council or a flat-out veto by countries like China. It's important to remember that China is looking at a multi-billion-dollar investment project just off the coast of where the Rohingya reside in Myanmar. So we have to understand the geopolitics and the geoeconomics that are involved. But I think that if there are circumstances by which countries can then come together outside the United Nations, impose sanctions on the Myanmar government to then provide a disincentive for them to act in the way that they are, at the very least to allow UN observers and NGOs into the country to help stabilize the province and help stabilize the conditions for the Rohingya. Short of that, there unfortunately doesn't seem to be a very promising future in this.
And Sam, just briefly wrapping up here, what is the most immediate need now and what has to be done in Bangladesh?
The most immediate need is, well, at least from a Canadian perspective, is for people to contribute to relief efforts on the ground, for the Canadian government to do the same, and for it to challenge international governments to provide the kind of financial resources immediately, urgently, so that that response can be implemented at the field level. But it's going to take a huge amount of resources, and it's going to need a very long-term strategy. You've got kids that are potentially going to lose years and years of schooling and lose out on the opportunity to build a safer future for themselves. So we need a swift, concerted response, and that is something that is within our control as an international community to effect change.
It's terribly tragic.
It is.
Thank you both very much, Saeed Khan and Sam Nutt.